Hello, everyone. I'm the parlor detective. It was the kind of late summer afternoon that felt almost too perfect to last. Sunlight sifted through the birch trees in golden streams, bees drifting lazily over the dense blaze of marigolds. And the air was warm yet unoppressive, brushed by the lightest breath from the meadows. In the tranquil village of Netherdyne, the garden club's annual tea was in full swing upon the vicarage's immaculate lawn. A local highlight that lured nearly everyone worth knowing, and even those not strictly worth knowing from within, a 10-mile radius. White linen tables curved in a horseshoe around the lawn's heart, each adorned with silver teaspoons and generous spreads of scones, seed cake, and Mrs. Reeves's famously wobbly jelly trifles. Ladies in cheerful florals and broad-brimmed hats conversed in tones of polite cordiality that barely concealed the undercurrent of village rivalry, whose peas had lasted longest, whose jam had taken the blue ribbon at the county fair, and inevitably, who had weathered the years passing with the least change. Miss Jane Marple sat slightly apart from the central commotion, perfectly framed beneath a lilac-laden archway. She wore dove gray with a simple lace collar and a sensible straw hat. Her presence, always quietly dignified, possessed an almost spectral quality. Most failed to notice her until she spoke, by which point she had often already formed an exact impression of everything worth noting. "More tea, Miss Marple?" asked young Alice Cribben, the vicar's niece, offering a teapot painted with faded violets. "Thank you, my dear. Just a splash," replied Miss Marple, her voice gentle but abstracted. Her eyes, blue and deceptively mild, swept the gathering with quiet interest. In one corner, Mrs. Hardington, the formidable garden club head, expounded on the virtues of compost enriched with crushed eggshells. In another, Colonel Denby waxed lyrical over his dahlias while discreetly eyeing the trifle bowl. And at the refreshment table stood the person whose arrival had stirred the greatest speculation in recent weeks, Miss Lavinia Pink. Strikingly tall and slender, her dark hair was drawn back in a polished chignon that sharpened her high cheekbones and stern mouth. A plain but elegant navy linen dress hinted at a woman once fashionable who now dressed with deliberate restraint. The pearl brooch pinned to her dress had belonged to her great-aunt, the late Miss Honoria Pink, whose passing had left more curiosity than grief in its wake. Honoria had been a formidable Netherdyne figure, a connoisseur of hats, a terror to shop girls, and the sort who refused central heating on principle. She had died peacefully in her sleep 6 weeks earlier at the age of 89, alone in her ivy-covered cottage, Elderbank. Her niece had returned from Spain, hurriedly, some whispered, and settled into the old house with an air of permanence that set certain villagers on edge. "She's brought back trunks and hat boxes by this dozen," murmured Mrs. Simcox to Miss Marple, lowering her voice unnecessarily. "All from Barcelona or Madrid or one of those peculiar foreign places. One of them, the big burgundy one. They say she wouldn't let the removal men touch at all." "Is that so?" said Miss Marple, stirring her tea with delicate care. "It's often the things one guards most closely that prove the most fragile." "Well, if you ask me," Mrs. Simcox sniffed, "that box is hiding something. Perhaps smuggled jewels or love letters or poison." Miss Marple merely smiled. "I should imagine if there were anything criminal in it, it would turn out to be something far more mundane. Things usually are." Meanwhile, Lavinia herself stood composed, a cup of Earl Grey in hand, listening politely as the vicar's wife discoursed on the finer points of fuchsia propagation. She appeared detached, movements precise, expression cool, yet now and then, her gaze flicked toward the path leading from the road to the garden, as if expecting, or perhaps dreading, someone's arrival. "She doesn't know how to blend in," murmured Miss Endicott, the village librarian, who had joined Miss Marple's table. "Striking, yes, but one can always tell when someone is only pretending to be at ease." "You've noticed that as well?" Miss Marple replied softly. The polite hum of conversation was suddenly interrupted by a loud, uneven clatter of footsteps on the stone path to the lawn. A figure stumbled into view, breathless, pale, cardigan askew, and sensible shoes speckled with dust. It was Tilly. Ronry, the young woman Lavinia Pink had lately engaged to clean and tend the house. Barely 19, she was unaccustomed to finding herself the center of so many eyes. "There you are! Oh, Miss Pink, you must come at once!" she cried, her voice high and shaking. The entire lawn seemed to still. Lavinia set down her teacup with slow precision. "Tilly, Compose yourself. What is it? In the sitting room, miss. I opened the cupboard like you said, behind the linen. I wasn't snooping, honest, but there's a man in there. Dead. A gasp rippled through the assembled ladies like wind through brittle leaves. Several dropped their forks. The vicar's wife swayed noticeably. Mrs. Hardington let out a strangled, "In Elderbank?" "Quite dead, I swear it. I didn't touch him," Tilly insisted, eyes wide. Lavinia blanched, but only for a heartbeat. "Stay here," she said firmly. "I'll go at once." "I'll come with you, dear," said Mrs. Hardington, ever the organizing force. "No, better not alone," Miss Marple added gently. "It's never wise to face the unexpected without witnesses or friends." The gathering dissolved into a flurry of murmurs and hastily claimed handbags. Miss Marple, Mrs. Hardington, Miss Endicott, and Mrs. Simcox moved briskly behind Lavinia, who advanced ahead with a rigid, almost mechanical determination. The vicar remained to soothe the more anxious guests. Elderbank Cottage stood at the far edge of the village, its gables half veiled by climbing roses and unruly laurel. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with lavender and camphor. The sitting room, with its heavy drapes and stiff-backed chairs, felt like a shrine to another age. The cupboard stood open. Inside, hunched at an awkward angle, was a man, middle-aged, slightly built, dressed in a cheap brown suit far too warm for the season. A silver-headed cane rested diagonally against his chest and one shoe had slipped halfway off. His head lolled forward at an unnatural slant. "He's not from Netherdyne," said Mrs. Simcoe. "I've never seen that man before." "I certainly don't know him," Lavinia said quietly. She stepped back, visibly shaken yet outwardly composed. Miss Marple spoke not a word. She moved forward with the slow precision of someone long acquainted with rheumatic knees, her gaze absorbing every detail. The faint scent of liniment mingled with something chemical, the dust along the man's cuffs, the flattened envelope, beneath his hand. From the floor near the cupboard, she retrieved an object, a silver hatpin, long and sharply tapered, the sort that had fallen out of fashion decades ago. Turning it slowly between her fingers, she murmured, "How curious." Then, glancing at Lavinia, she added, "And what, I wonder, did he come here to find?" Outside, the crunch of a motor car on gravel signaled Inspector Cray's arrival. Miss Marple stepped aside, her face composed, her thoughts already turning over. After all, cupboards did not fill themselves, and hat boxes, when they refused to open, often contained more than mothballs. It took no more than 20 minutes for the startling news to sweep from Elderbank Cottage to the vicarage lawn, and from there, like a brisk wind over dry grass, through cottages, bakeries, gardens, and shops. By tea-time, everyone from the grocer's boy to the retired sea captain on Woodbine Hill had heard the same breathless headline, "A dead man found in Lavinia Pink's cupboard." The details shifted with each telling. Some swore he bore a bullet wound, others that he clutched a note confessing to a foreign spy ring. One particularly eager version had him wearing a monocle and carrying a forged passport. But one fact remained undisputed. Lavinia Pink had returned to Netherdean less than a month ago, and now a stranger lay dead in her home. At the center of the stir, Inspector Cray sat stiff-backed in Elderbank's narrow sitting room, jotting notes into a worn leather-bound pad. Tall, sandy-haired, with a permanently furrowed brow and the patience of a man long accustomed to villagers reporting suspicious footprints that turned out to be their own, he had invited Miss Marple to remain during the initial questioning. "You always see the bits we miss," Cray had muttered with resigned respect. She sat demurely in a corner chair, knitting something indeterminate in pale green wool, though her eyes missed nothing. The body had been taken away by constables an hour earlier. Now Lavinia Pink sat opposite the inspector, composed yet visibly strained, her hands neatly folded in her lap, a cup of tea, untouched, at her side. "You maintain, Miss Pink," said Cray, "that you do not know the man found in your cupboard?" "I've never seen him before in my life," Lavinia replied with deliberate clarity. "I swear it. I've no idea how he even got inside." "Had the cupboard been opened recently?" "I asked my housemaid Tilly to dust it this morning. I hardly use it, but it needed freshening. I don't go rummaging through it myself." "You mentioned he carried a cane, silver-handled," said Cray. Any recollection of such a man calling here? None. I've had no visitors, no callers, not since I arrived. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Forgive me, Miss Pink. May I ask something? Was the house ever left unlatched in your early days here? Doors standing open while you were in the garden, perhaps? Lavinia turned her head. Possibly. I was busy sorting Aunt Honoria's belongings, opening trunks. There were workers coming and going. I didn't monitor every entrance. It's a safe village? Or was? Miss Marple nodded. So easy, isn't it? To trust one's surroundings, especially when one believes they've returned to the familiar. Lavinia met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. It doesn't feel familiar anymore. Outside, the villagers were doing what they did best, talking. At the Rose and Crown, men debated whether the dead man was a burglar, a blackmailer, or Lavinia's foreign lover. The prevailing view was that the body hadn't been there long, not ponging yet, as Mr. Sims the plumber put it. Meanwhile, in the front room of Mrs. Simcox's semi-detached cottage, a compact knot of ladies was drawing conclusions at speed. She didn't scream when they found him, said Miss Endicott, pouring another round of tea. That's very telling. Or perhaps she couldn't scream, offered Alice Cribben. People do go mute from shock, you know. Rubbish, declared Mrs. Simcox. Lavinia's the sort who doesn't blink when the milk curdles. She's accustomed to unpleasant things, mark my words. Accustomed to them? Alice asked, startled. Well, Spain and all that, sniffed Mrs. Simcox. And she's still got that hatbox. Unopened, I'll have you know. They all nodded grimly. At the vicarage, the vicar's wife, who considered gossip a sin yet could never resist overhearing it, attempted to steady her nerves the next morning by calling on Miss Marple with a small basket of scones. I can't bear it, she said, handing the basket over. Such a beautiful day and everyone pretending it isn't. Frightening. I saw the pathologist go in this morning with his little brown case. I'm afraid people are often more dangerous when they're frightened, said Miss Marple, accepting the scones with gentle hands. They become certain of things they've never actually seen. Do you think Lavinia is guilty? Miss Marple paused only briefly. I think she's concealing something, but that isn't always the same thing, is it? Inspector Cray had ordered a search of the house. Not a formal warrant, not yet, but a quiet sweep for anything unusual. Lavinia consented, her lips tight, and it was Constable Beach who unearthed something of interest. In the back bedroom, Honoria's old sewing room, the constable lifted the lid of a carved wooden sewing basket. Inside, a faded envelope clung to the bottom with a dab of dried gum. It was addressed in looping handwriting to Miss Lavinia Pink, Elderbank Cottage. Beneath, in smaller script, please do not open until the matter is resolved. Within lay a single sheet of paper, creased and yellowed with age. It bore no signature, only one line. You must understand, the past will not stay buried under hats and lace. Cray examined it with narrowed eyes. Cryptic. Do you recognize this, Miss Pink? Lavinia paled. No, I've never seen it before. Her tone, a fraction too defensive, made Miss Marple lower her knitting. Later that afternoon, as sunlight slanted across her neat little parlor, Miss Marple placed the envelope inside her own notebook. Cray had permitted her to keep a copy, though not without a raised brow. You think it's one of your tidy puzzles, don't you, Miss Marple? He had muttered. But this isn't village mischief. This is murder. Oh, but murder is village mischief, Inspector, she had replied mildly. Only more final. That evening, Miss Marple took a quiet walk along the lane behind Elderbank. It was a narrow track that once connected cottages before motorcars changed the village's habits. Mossy stones jutted from the hedges, ivy stirred in the breeze. A tangle of wild roses framed the side gate to Lavinia's garden. She paused, her gaze thoughtful. The cottage stood dark, curtains drawn, no figure at the window, but a faint glimmer caught her eye, something metallic, carelessly left beneath the rosebush. She stepped closer. It was a broken cufflink, silver, with the initial H engraved on its face. Miss Marple held it up to the fading light, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, but in the quiet dusk she seemed already to know. Whoever the man in the cupboard had been, he had come back for something, and someone in Netherdean had ensured he would not leave. The next morning dawned under a restless sky, soft gray clouds drifting low, as though the weather itself sensed the undercurrent unsettling the village. Netherdean, usually occupied with biscuits, birdsong, and begonias, now carried a thread of unease. For the first time in years, front doors stayed bolted. Curtains that once hung wide to greet the sun now remained half-drawn, as if to shield households from the gaze of watchful neighbors, or perhaps from their own spiraling speculations. At Elderbank Cottage, Inspector Cray returned with purpose. The constables had identified the dead man, Harold Cantry, a drifter of sorts, last employed as a shipping clerk in Eastbourne. He had no criminal record, but whispers told of debts, erratic work, and vague links to minor confidence men. Cray, ever the pragmatist, found it suspicious enough.
"He didn't come here for a nature walk," Cray said grimly to Miss Marple as they sat again in the small, fusty drawing room. "No," Miss Marple replied, pouring him a modest cup of tea. "But that doesn't mean he came to blackmail."
Anyone either. People return to places for reasons that remain unresolved. Cray frowned. Sentimental reasons don't usually get a man killed and stuffed in a cupboard. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Oh, but Inspector, people have died for far pettier motives than sentiment or guilt. Sometimes they die for pride or convenience. Once in my village, a woman poisoned her sister over the cut of a dress." Cray gave her a long, silent look. Lavinia Pink was fraying by the hour. Since the discovery of Harold Cantry's body, her icy composure had thinned to brittle defensiveness. Again and again she repeated the same answers. No, she had not invited the man. No, she did not recognize the name. No, she could not explain how he had entered her home without her knowledge. The strain now showed in the taut set of her mouth and the clipped edge to her voice. And then, of course, there was the hatbox, still locked, still unopened. Miss Marple had inquired about it gently, almost in passing, during a visit with a small jar of preserves. Lavinia had paused mid-sentence. "It contains nothing of interest," she said stiffly. "Just mementos of my aunt, personal things. I haven't had the courage to sort through them yet." "Of course," Miss Marple had replied kindly. "I recall when my cousin Alicia passed, we couldn't bring ourselves to open her embroidery chest for nearly a year. And when we did, we discovered she had hidden her husband's love letters in the lining. There had been no reply, only each a mon flicker in Lavinia's eyes, something tightly guarded. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray had begun to narrow his field of suspects. The first, perhaps the most obvious, was Tilly Ronry, the maid who had discovered the body. Tilly had a nervous temperament, wide eyes perpetually on the brink of tears, and a habit of twisting her apron strings whenever she was asked a direct question. But Cray, who had seen feigned innocence more times than he cared to count, wasn't, prepared to dismiss her simply because she looked harmless. "Tell me again, Tilly," he said as they sat together in Elderbank's kitchen. "You opened the cupboard because Miss Pink asked you to dust it?" "Yes, sir," she replied, voice trembling. "It hadn't been touched since before Miss Honoria passed. Miss Pink said it might be musty. I was only doing as she told me. I didn't even open it fully at first. Just pulled the doors, and he was there." "Did you touch anything?" "No, sir," I screamed. "Had you ever seen the man before?" "No, sir, not until yesterday." "But you're certain he was already dead?" "Yes, he wasn't breathing, and his eyes. Oh, I don't want to remember it." Inspector Cray leaned back, studying her restless hands. "And Miss Pink's reaction?" "She went white. Didn't say anything at first, just stared. Then she told me to fetch help, said to run to the vicarage lawn." "And you saw no one else that morning? No deliveries? No unexpected visitors?" "No one, sir. Only Mr. Little, the postman, but he just brought letters." Cray jotted something in his notebook. "You may go. Don't leave the village, Tilly." She nodded quickly and slipped away, clearly relieved. Later that afternoon, Cray called on Mrs. Simcox, not out of suspicion, but to gather information about the village as much as the case. She received him in her tidy sitting room with a plate of ginger biscuits and an air of considerable importance. Now, I'm not one to speak ill of my neighbors, she began, which meant she was precisely the sort. But if you're looking for scandal, Lavinia is your girl. What sort of scandal exactly? Well, there was the business of her leaving suddenly all those years ago. Off to Spain after a row with her aunt. Something about a man, though no one ever got the whole story. But she came back very suddenly, too, you'll note, and without a word about her life abroad. That always means something. You think she's hiding something? Mrs. Simcox leaned in. She walks about like she owns the place, but I say she's frightened. Keeps her doors locked at night, fusses with the windows. I saw her jump when the baker's cart rattled past too fast last week. Cray made another note. One more thing, Inspector, though I shouldn't say it. Yes? That hat box, still locked, and not just latched, mind you. Locked. What sort of woman locks up a hat box? Unless there's something inside that's not meant to be seen. The clue that troubled Miss Marple most was the broken silver cufflink she had found near the rose bush. Cray had sent it to the county lab, but Miss Marple had already formed a notion, or at least a suspicion. The cufflink bore the initial H, which rather conveniently matched Harold Cantry, but it had not been found inside the house. It had been lying outside beneath the roses. That suggested he had not entered by the front. No, he had slipped in unseen, or perhaps someone had slipped out that way without notice. She revisited the spot that evening. The ground beneath the roses was firm, yet small hollows in the soil hinted at disturbance. A loosened claw, a flattened leaf. Not proof, but signs. Someone had knelt there or dropped something in haste. As she straightened, a voice startled her. You're always 3 steps ahead, aren't you? It was the vicar, stepping from the footpath with a kindly smile. Or is it 4? Only half a step today, said Miss Marple. This case is more tangled than most. Lavinia? He asked gently. She's not guilty, Miss Marple said at last. But she's afraid. Afraid that something she did, or failed to do, has made her responsible. The vicar frowned. That's a heavy burden. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But someone else here carries a heavier one. The man who recognized Harold Cantry and hoped no one else would. She glanced toward Elderbank's chimney, dark against the evening sky. There's something in that hat box, she added softly. And when it's opened, I think we shall understand more than just the murder. The morning air in Netherdean was crisp with the promise of early autumn. Leaves, once bright with summer green, were beginning to turn, soft golds and russets, drifting lazily down to the cobbled lanes. For all its quaint charm, the village carried a weight that day, a quiet heaviness beneath its cheerful surface. Miss Marple, seated in her neat sitting room with the window open to the gentle rustle of the old oak, was reviewing the notes she had scribbled over the last 2 days. The envelope found in the sewing basket still rested on the table beside her, the faded line scrawled in looping script. You must understand the past will not stay buried under hats and lace. The words echoed in her mind with the cadence of a riddle. Her fingers smoothed the creased paper, eyes narrowing in thought. What past? And what secrets might be hidden beneath Honoria Pink's carefully preserved hats, or the locked hat box Lavinia avoided so assiduously? A sharp knock at the door broke her reverie. Come in, she called softly. Inspector Cray entered, looking as tired as ever, though a glint of purpose lit his eyes. Morning, Miss Marple, he said, stepping inside. You always seem to be 1 step ahead. Thought you might want to see this. He handed her a small brown envelope, official, stamped with the county police crest. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph, aged yet clear, a black and white image of a young woman in a feathered hat, standing beside a tall man with a silver-handled cane. It's Harold Cantry, said Cray. The woman, we're not certain, but from her resemblance to the late Miss Honoria Pink, we think it's her, many years ago. Miss Marple studied the image. The woman's eyes, sharp and unyielding beneath the brim, seemed to guard 1,000 stories. The man beside her wore a faint smile, one hand resting on the silver cane. This was found in the village archives, Cray explained, tucked among a bundle of letters addressed to Miss Honoria. Some of those letters went missing after her death. Missing letters? Miss Marple's curiosity sharpened. Yes, Cray replied. The ones tied to Harold Cantry. Seems their connection ran deeper than anyone guessed. Miss Marple's fingers traced the photograph's edges. It would seem the past is catching up with Netherdean. By afternoon, the village hummed with fresh gossip. News of the photograph spread quickly, stirring speculation over Lavinia, Pink's true link to Harold Cantry, and perhaps to her great-aunt Honoria. At the post office, Mrs. Trent and her assistant whispered over the day's mail. Do you think Miss Pink and Mr. Cantry were lovers? Mrs. Trent mused. Or maybe... Harold was blackmailing her, her assistant breathed, eyes wide. Blackmailing? Mrs. Trent gasped. Oh, I do hope not. Passing the shop on her way to the market, Miss Marple overheard but said nothing. She knew better than most that gossip was often half-truth, wrapped in imagination. Back at Elderbank, Miss Marple received a rare invitation. Lavinia Pink had agreed to let her see the infamous Hatbox. It's in the back bedroom, Lavinia said quietly, leading the way. The room was neat and orderly, faintly scented with mothballs and old lavender. The Hatbox rested on the wooden floor, its burgundy leather catching the afternoon light with a soft sheen. Lavinia hesitated. I'm not certain what you expect to find. Perhaps only a trinket, Miss Marple replied gently. But sometimes the smallest detail unlocks the greatest mystery. With a slow breath, Lavinia drew a small brass key from her pocket. The lock yielded with a soft metallic snap. Lifting the lid revealed layers of neatly wrapped tissue, delicate lace handkerchiefs and a collection of old hats, some adorned with feathers, others finished with velvet ribbons. At the very bottom lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded pink ribbon. Miss Marple's eyes lit. May I? Lavinia gave a small nod, passing the letters into her hands. The top envelope was addressed in the same looping script as the cryptic note. Carefully, Miss Marple untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. It read, Dear Honoria, I hope this letter finds you in better health than when last we spoke. The matter that brought Harold Cantry to Netherdean cannot be left unsettled. There are truths buried deeper than the roots of the old oak, and secrets held tighter than the seams of your finest gowns. Yours in hope and caution, a friend. Miss Marple looked up. This is no ordinary correspondence. Someone both cared deeply and feared greatly. Lavinia's eyes shimmered with unspoken sadness. My aunt was a proud woman, but pride often shields guilt. That evening, Miss Marple took her customary stroll through the village. The streets were quiet now, shadows stretching long as dusk settled. She paused outside the small chapel, where Sunday services were held, her gaze lingering on the stained glass windows. Inside, the vicar was closing his books for the week ahead. Seeing Miss Marple, he stepped out. Good evening, Jane, he greeted warmly. Good evening, Reverend. I was hoping you might recall anything unusual about Honoria Pink's final years. The vicar considered. She was distant, not unkind but withdrawn. In recent times, she rarely attended services. Some whispered it was a matter of conscience. Conscience? Miss Marple asked softly. Well, there were rumors, he admitted. Old quarrels, family disputes, but nothing certain. Still, I believe something weighed heavily upon her. Miss Marple nodded. Secrets have a way of growing heavier when left unspoken. Back in her sitting room, the yard detective's mind was busy weaving threads. She had the photograph, the letters, the broken cufflink, and the body of a man who had returned. To Netherdean, perhaps to settle old scores or uncover long-buried truths. And then there was the Hatbox itself, a carefully guarded vessel of memory and hidden connections. Miss Marple's thoughts circled back to the note. You must understand, the past will not stay buried under hats and lace. The past was restless in Netherdean, and she was certain the key to the mystery lay within those delicate letters and half-forgotten recollections. But who had wanted to silence Harold Cantry so cruelly, and why? Tomorrow, she resolved, she would speak again with Lavinia, and with those who had known Honoria best. There were still questions to ask, and answers yet to be unearthed. For in this village, beneath the polite facades and the blooming gardens, the truth waited patiently, like a hatbox left unopened for far too long. The morning mist clung low over Netherin as Miss Marple made her way to the village hall, where a small gathering had been called at Inspector Cray's request. The news of Harold Canry's death had unsettled the village more than anyone cared to admit, and the inspector hoped the meeting might calm the growing tension. As she neared the hall, a low murmur floated through the air. Familiar, yet watchful. Faces greeted her, villagers who had spent the last few days under suspicion's long shadow, eager either to clear themselves or subtly cast doubt on others. Miss Marple paused just outside, taking in the scene. There was the vicar, brow furrowed, as he spoke with Mrs. Hardington, the formidable president of the garden club. Nearby stood Colonel Denby, the retired officer whose stern bearing hid more than a few village secrets, and Mrs. Simcox, the ever-watchful spinster with a sharp taste for gossip. Lavinia Pink was there too, seated quietly near the back, hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked fragile yet resolute, a woman burdened with more than grief. Inspector Cray's voice carried as he began. "Thank you all for coming. I know these are difficult days, but I ask for your patience and cooperation. Further inquiries will be made. In the meantime, I remind you, any unusual activity should be reported at once." A few nods and murmurs followed. Villagers exchanged glances, some wary, others guarded. Miss Marple, as ever, listened far more than she spoke. When the formalities ended, the crowd broke into small knots of conversation. Mrs. Hardington approached Miss Marple with a tentative smile. "Jane, I've been meaning to speak with you," she said. "It's about Lavinia. I fear there's more to her story than has been told." Miss Marple arched a brow. "Do tell." Mrs. Hardington lowered her voice. "Years ago, before she left for Spain, there were whispers of a scandal involving her and a certain gentleman, who was not Harold Canry." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's interest deepened. "And who might this gentleman be?" Mrs. Hardington glanced about nervously. "Mr. Giles Pembroke. He was often seen at Elderbank, and I'm told a suitor rather abruptly turned away." Miss Marple inclined her head. A rejected suitor is frequently a source of lingering tensions. Later, Miss Marple found herself in the village library, where Miss Endicott, the librarian, was bent over a stack of old newspapers. "I did some digging," Miss Endicott said in a low voice as Miss Marple took a seat. "There was indeed an incident involving Lavinia Pink and Mr. Pembroke." "Details," Miss Marple encouraged. "It seems Pembroke was known for a fiery temper. A confrontation with Lavinia at a village fete ended badly, accusations flying on both sides. Shortly after, Lavinia left rather suddenly for Spain," Miss Marple finished softly. "Sometimes a scandal is less about what occurred than what people feared." That afternoon, Inspector Cray arranged to question Giles Pembroke, who lived on the edge of Netherin. Pembroke was in his late 40s, tall and lean, with a sharp jaw and cold eyes that seldom warmed. He greeted them with thin courtesy but no welcome. "Mr. Pembroke, I understand you knew both Honoria and Lavinia Pink well," Cray began. "Yes," Pembroke replied curtly. "Honoria was formidable. Lavinia, well, we had our differences." "Can you tell us about your relationship with Miss Pink?" Pembroke's gaze hardened. "She was difficult, proud. We were once engaged, but it was broken off. I won't discuss private matters." From her quiet place in the room, Miss Marple noticed a faint twitch in his left hand and a small scar near his temple. "Did you ever have contact with Harold Canontree?" she asked gently. Pembroke's eyes narrowed. "No, never met the man." Cray's brow lifted slightly, but he said nothing. Back at Elderbank, Lavinia received a visit from Miss Marple. The two women sat by the window, sunlight casting soft patterns across the lace curtains. "Miss Pink," Miss Marple began gently, "there are many who wish to know what lies beneath the surface, but I believe some secrets are buried for good reason." Lavinia's lips trembled. "I only wish the past would stay where it belongs." "But it rarely does," Miss Marple replied. "What do you think your aunt guarded so carefully in that hat box?" Lavinia shook her head. Memories, old promises, things better left untouched. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sometimes understanding those memories is the only way to find peace. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone, piecing together the fragments of conversations, letters, and quiet observations. She thought of the Hatbox, the letters, the broken cufflink, and the men who had crossed paths with Elderbank. The village was a tapestry woven with threads of pride, resentment, and long-nursed grudges. Somewhere within those tangled strands lay the truth behind Harold Canry's death. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a detail she had missed before: the pattern on a handkerchief Lavinia had worn during their meeting, edged with delicate lace that matched one described in an old letter. A subtle connection. Tomorrow might bring answers. The dawn mist clung to the fields around Netherine, curling lazily in the soft breeze, as if the village itself hesitated to greet the day. The previous day's unrest had settled into a taut stillness, like the drawn string of a violin awaiting the first pluck. Walking her habitual morning route, Miss Marple felt that quiet tension in her bones. The village's peace was fragile, poised on the brink of revelation. Passing through the square, she noticed a small crowd gathered outside the police station. The usual orderly line of villagers reporting trivial matters had been replaced by anxious murmurs and sidelong glances. Curious, Miss Marple moved closer, catching fragments of talk. Another body found. Same man, isn't it? This changes everything. Her pulse quickened. Another victim. Another death bound to the mystery that already gripped Netherine. Inspector Cray stepped from the station, his expression grave but composed. Seeing her, he beckoned her inside. "Jane," he said quietly, "I'm afraid matters have taken an unexpected turn." Within, Cray laid out the facts. Late last night, a body was discovered in the woods beyond Netherdene, near the old mill. It's Harold Canry again, or at least a man closely matching his description. This one bears severe bruising, likely from a struggle. He appears to have been dumped there. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. 2 bodies of the same man? That cannot be. It's baffling, Cray admitted. Perhaps an attempt to throw us off, or a carefully staged distraction. Her fingers tightened on her handbag. Or someone desperately concealing the truth. Word of the second body raced through Netherine, stoking fresh waves of fear and conjecture. Once a place of mild gossip, the village now seethed with suspicion, trust unraveling thread by thread. At the Rose and Crown, patrons argued over the meaning of the discovery, some insisting the man had been a spy or criminal, others whispering of dark family feuds and forbidden liaisons. Theories multiplied, but none bore the weight of certainty. Miss Marple, as ever, sought clarity amid the noise. She knew the truth often dwelt in quiet details: the fleeting glance, the slight hesitation, the small but telling inconsistency. That afternoon, she called once more upon Lavinia Pink. The woman's composure was thinner now, shadows etched beneath her eyes. The locked hat box still sat unopened on the floor. "Lavinia," Miss Marple began softly, "have you noticed anything unusual since the first body was found? Visitors? Strange noises? Anything out of place?" Lavinia shook her head. "No, nothing, except last night I heard footsteps outside near the rose bush." "Did you see anyone?" "No, I was too frightened to look." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "The rose bush. That's where I found the broken cufflink." Lavinia's breath caught. "Yes, I wondered about that." Miss Marple tapped her chin. "Someone may be sending a message, or trying to unnerve you." Meanwhile, Inspector Cray's inquiries pressed on with new urgency. He summoned Giles Pembroke for further questioning. The exchange was tense, Pembroke's icy manner unyielding. "I understand you were near the woods last night," Cray said bluntly. Pembroke's eyes flickered in surprise, quickly shuttered. "I was out for a walk, nothing more." "Did you see anyone else? Anyone suspicious?" "No one. It was late, and the woods were empty." Cray frowned but held back. He was beginning to suspect Pembroke was concealing something significant. As dusk settled, Miss Marple made her way to the village archives. The librarian, Miss Endicott, greeted her with a blend of excitement and unease. "We found something," she whispered. "A ledger, tucked away among Honoria Pink's papers. It lists names, dates, and payments, some recent, some decades, old. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Payments for what? That's the question, Miss Endicott murmured. There are hints of debts, favors, perhaps bribes. One entry caught my attention, a payment to an H.C., dated just weeks before his death. Miss Marple's thoughts quickened. Harold Canry. Yes, but there's more. The ledger also names H.P., E.D.G.E., and G. Some Honoria Pink and Giles Pembroke among them. Miss Endicott's voice trembled. It appears there were tangled dealings, possibly money, possibly secrets. Back at Elderbank Cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the implications. The past was no longer tucked neatly beneath lace and hats. It was coming undone, thread by fragile thread. A knock on the door startled her. Lavinia entered, cradling a small bundle wrapped in faded silk. I found this in my aunt's desk, she said, handing it over. I didn't dare open it until now. Miss Marple carefully unwrapped the bundle, revealing a delicate silver locket engraved with the initials H.P. inside was a miniature portrait of a young woman, stern yet beautiful. Tucked beside it was a folded note, the ink faded but still legible. To my dearest Honoria, if ever my secrets should weigh too heavily, remember that loyalty binds tighter than blood. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Secrets indeed. As night deepened, she sat by her fire, the pieces of the puzzle spread before her like a lacework pattern. 2 bodies, or perhaps 1 man twice placed. A silver cufflink broken beneath the rose. Bush. Letters and ledgers hinting at debts, loyalty, and shadowed alliances. The locked hat box still waited, silent and unopened. Yet most troubling was the new certainty that beneath the village's placid veneer lay a web of grudges and dangerous debts. Someone was desperate to keep the past buried, and Miss Marple knew the truth would only surface when the final thread was drawn tight. The morning after the locket's discovery broke over Netherdean under low gray skies, the village subdued beneath its own secrets. Church bells tolled softly in the distance, their sounds swallowed by thick mist drifting over the green. Miss Marple stood at her kitchen window, stirring her tea without drinking. The note inside the locket repeated itself in her mind like a refrain. Loyalty binds tighter than blood. It was no mere sentiment. It was a warning, perhaps even a plea. Her gaze drifted to the small velvet hat box in the sitting room. In recent days, it had acquired an almost menacing presence, like a silent guest no one dared address. She had not pressed Lavinia to open it. That moment, she knew, would come of its own accord. Turning from the window, her mind settled on a plan, provoke a reaction, see which thread began to loosen. Her chance arrived in the form of an invitation. Mrs. There were whispers of a scandal involving her and a certain gentleman, who was not Harold Canry. Indeed. Miss Marple's interest deepened. And who might this gentleman be? Mrs. Hardington glanced about nervously. Mr. Giles Pembroke. He was often seen at Elderbank, and I'm told a suitor rather abruptly turned away. Miss Marple inclined her head. A rejected suitor is frequently a source of lingering tensions. Later, Miss Marple found herself in the village library, where Miss Endicott, the librarian, was bent over a stack of old newspapers. I did some digging, Miss Endicott said in a low voice as Miss Marple took a seat. There was indeed an incident involving Lavinia Pink and Mr. Pembroke. Details, Miss Marple encouraged. It seems Pembroke was known for a fiery temper. A confrontation with Lavinia at a village fete ended badly, accusations flying on both sides. Shortly after, Lavinia left rather suddenly for Spain, Miss Marple finished softly. Sometimes a scandal is less about what occurred than what people feared. That afternoon, Inspector Cray arranged to question Giles Pembroke, who lived on the edge of Netherine. Pembroke was in his late 40s, tall and lean, with a sharp jaw and cold eyes that seldom warmed. He greeted them with thin courtesy but no welcome. Mr. Pembroke, I understand you knew both Honoria and Lavinia Pink well, Cray began. Yes, Pembroke replied curtly. Honoria was formidable. Lavinia, well, we had our differences. Can you tell us about your relationship with Miss Pink? Pembroke's gaze hardened. She was difficult, Proud. We were once engaged, but it was broken off. I won't discuss private matters. From her quiet place in the room, Miss Marple noticed a faint twitch in his left hand and a small scar near his temple. Did you ever have contact with Harold Cannontree? She asked gently. Pembroke's eyes narrowed. No, never met the man. Cray's brow lifted slightly, but he said nothing. Back at Elderbank, Lavinia received a visit from Miss Marple. The two women sat by the window, sunlight casting soft patterns across the lace curtains. Miss Pink, Miss Marple began gently, there are many who wish to know what lies beneath the surface, but I believe some secrets are buried for good reason. Lavinia's lips trembled. I only wish the past would stay where it belongs. But it rarely does, Miss Marple replied. What do you think your aunt guarded so carefully in that hat box? Lavinia shook her head. Memories, old promises, things better left untouched. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sometimes understanding those memories is the only way to find peace. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone, piecing together the fragments of conversations, letters, and quiet observations. She thought of the hat box, the letters, the broken cufflink, and the men who had crossed paths with Elderbank. The village was a tapestry woven with threads of pride, resentment, and long-nursed grudges. Somewhere within those tangled strands lay the truth behind Harold Cannonree's death. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a detail she had missed before, the pattern on a handkerchief Lavinia had worn during their meeting, edged with delicate lace that matched one described in an old letter. A subtle connection. Tomorrow might bring answers. The dawn mist clung to the fields around Netherine, curling lazily in the soft breeze, as if the village itself hesitated to greet the day. The previous day's unrest had settled into a taut stillness, like the drawn string of a violin awaiting the first pluck. Walking her habitual morning route, Miss Marple felt that quiet tension in her bones. The village's peace was fragile, poised on the brink of revelation. Passing through the square, she noticed a small crowd gathered outside the police station. The usual orderly line of villagers reporting trivial matters had been replaced by anxious murmurs and sidelong glances. Curious, Miss Marple moved closer, catching fragments of talk. Another body found. Same man, isn't it? This changes everything. Her pulse quickened. Another victim. Another death bound to the mystery that already gripped Netherine. Inspector Cray stepped from the station, his expression grave but composed. Seeing her, he beckoned her inside. Jane, he said quietly, I'm afraid matters have taken an unexpected turn. Within, Cray laid out the facts. Late last night, a body was discovered in the woods beyond Netherdean, near the old mill. It's Harold Cannonree again, or at least a man closely matching his description. This one bears severe bruising, likely from a struggle. He appears to have been dumped there. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. 2 bodies of the same man? That cannot be. It's baffling, Cray admitted. Perhaps an attempt to throw us off, or a carefully staged distraction. Her fingers tightened on her handbag. Or someone desperately concealing the truth. Word of the second body raced through Netherine, stoking fresh waves of fear and conjecture. Once a place of mild gossip, the village now seethed with suspicion, trust unraveling thread by thread. At the Rose and Crown, patrons argued over the meaning of the discovery, some insisting the man had been a spy or criminal, others whispering of dark family feuds and forbidden liaisons. Theories multiplied, but none bore the weight of certainty. Miss Marple, as ever, sought clarity amid the noise. She knew the truth often dwelt in quiet details, the fleeting glance, the slight hesitation, the small but telling inconsistency. That afternoon, she called once more upon Lavinia Pink. The woman's composure was thinner now, shadows etched beneath her eyes. The locked hat box still sat unopened on the floor. Lavinia, Miss Marple began softly, have you noticed? Anything unusual since the first body was found? Visitors? Strange noises? Anything out of place? Lavinia shook her head. No, nothing, except last night I heard footsteps outside near the rose bush. Did you see anyone? No, I was too frightened to look. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The rose bush. That's where I found the broken cufflink. Lavinia's breath caught. Yes, I wondered about that. Miss Marple tapped her chin. Someone may be sending a message, or trying to unnerve you. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray's inquiries pressed on with new urgency. He summoned Giles Pembroke for further questioning. The exchange was tense, Pembroke's icy manner unyielding. I understand you were near the woods last night, Cray said bluntly. Pembroke's eyes flickered in surprise, quickly shuddered. I was out for a walk, nothing more. Did you see anyone else? Anyone suspicious? No one. It was late, and the woods were empty. Cray frowned but held back. He was beginning to suspect Pembroke was concealing something significant. As dusk settled, Miss Marple made her way to the village archives. The librarian, Miss Endicott, greeted her with a blend of excitement and unease. We found something, she whispered. A ledger, tucked away among Honoria Pink's papers. It lists names, dates, and payments, some recent, some decades, old. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Payments for what? That's the question, Miss Endicott murmured. There are hints of debts, favors, perhaps bribes. One entry caught my attention, a payment to an HC, dated just weeks before his death. Miss Marple's thoughts quickened. Harold Canry. Yes, but there's more. The ledger also names HP, EDGE, and G, some Honoria Pink and Giles Pembroke among them. Miss Endicott's voice trembled. It appears there were tangled dealings, possibly money, possibly secrets. Back at Elderbank Cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the implications. The past was no longer tucked neatly beneath lace and hats. It was coming undone, thread by fragile thread. A knock on the door startled her. Lavinia entered, cradling a small bundle wrapped in faded silk. I found this in my aunt's desk, she said, handing it over. I didn't dare open it until now. Miss Marple carefully unwrapped the bundle, revealing a delicate silver locket engraved with the initials HP inside was a miniature portrait of a young woman, stern yet beautiful. Tucked beside it was a folded note, the ink faded but still legible. To my dearest Honoria, if ever my secrets should weigh too heavily, remember that loyalty binds tighter than blood. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Secrets indeed. As night deepened, she sat by her fire, the pieces of the puzzle spread before her like a lacework pattern. 2 bodies, or perhaps 1 man twice placed. A silver cufflink broken beneath the rose. Bush. Letters and ledgers hinting at debts, loyalty, and shadowed alliances. The locked hatbox still waited, silent and unopened. Yet most troubling was the new certainty that beneath the village's placid veneer lay a web of grudges and dangerous debts. Someone was desperate to keep the past buried, and Miss Marple knew the truth would only surface when the final thread was drawn tight. The morning after the locket's discovery broke over Netherdean under low gray skies, the village subdued beneath its own secrets. Church bells tolled softly in the distance, their sounds swallowed by thick mist drifting over the green. Miss Marple stood at her kitchen window, stirring her tea without drinking. The note inside the locket repeated itself in her mind like a refrain, loyalty binds tighter than blood. It was no mere sentiment, it was a warning, perhaps even a plea. Her gaze drifted to the small velvet hatbox in the sitting room. In recent days it had acquired an almost menacing presence, like a silent guest no one dared address. She had not pressed Lavinia to open it. That moment she knew would come of its own accord. Turning from the window, her mind settled on a plan, provoke a reaction, see which thread began to loosen. Her chance arrived in the form of an invitation. Mrs. Cla, the vicar's wife, was hosting an afternoon sewing circle at the church hall, a gathering of practical women with a fondness for conjecture. Miss Marple accepted with polite warmth. Walking down the lane, she sensed the shift in the village. People weren't merely wary now, they were watching one another. Inside the church hall, the usual clink of knitting needles and soft rustle of fabric seemed dulled beneath the weight of recent events. Mrs. Clee welcomed her warmly, though with the distracted air of someone who had heard too many rumors to know which to trust. I do wonder, Jane, she murmured as they arranged their embroidery hoops, what your take is on all this. 2 bodies, a locked hatbox, and Lavinia Pink jumping at every shadow. Miss Marple smiled softly. It does seem the past is not quite so past as we believed, doesn't it? Her tone was mild, yet her words rippled through the room like a stone dropped into still water. Several heads turned. "Well," said Mrs. Dashley, abandoning any pretense of focusing on her quilting, "there have been whispers about Honoria Pink for years. Always kept to herself, but folks said she knew things. And Lavinia, she was never quite settled." "Old Harold Cannontree certainly stirred things up one way or another," someone muttered. Miss Marple let the conversation play out, quietly noting who spoke, what they said, and the tone in which they said it. Lavinia's name, she observed, seemed to unsettle them more than murder itself. The village feared secrets far more than death. That evening she arranged a discreet meeting with Inspector Cray at the vicarage, under the polite guise of returning a borrowed volume of Tennyson. He listened intently as she shared her observations. "She's frightened," Miss Marple said of Lavinia. "Not in a hysterical way. She's composed, but under strain. It's the kind of fear that comes from knowing a secret and dreading its exposure." Cray frowned. "You think she's hiding something?" "I think she's protecting something, or someone." "And the second body?" "I doubt the second Harold Canry is who we're meant to think he is." Cray raised an eyebrow. "A body conveniently found, conveniently dressed, discovered, at night in a spot certain to draw attention. No identification. No one's confirmed his identity beyond his clothing and a vague likeness." Cray's nod was slow. "A plant, perhaps." Miss Marple's face was unreadable. "Or a substitution." Later that night, she made her way once more to Elderbank Cottage. Lavinia opened the door cautiously, her face pale. "I couldn't sleep," Miss Marple said gently. "I hope I'm not intruding." Lavinia ushered her in without a word. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room. The hatbox still sat on the ottoman, silent and untouched. "I've found secrets grow heavier with time," Miss Marple said as she settled into a chair. "Like damp clothes left too long, they weigh us down until we can scarcely move." Lavinia stared into the flames. "I didn't ask for any of this." "I believe you. He just appeared, Harold. After all those years, I thought he was dead. Aunt Honoria had never spoken of him, only said he'd gone, disgraced." Miss Marple waited. "He came asking for money," Lavinia continued, threatening to reveal things about Aunt Honoria, about what happened in 1934. "What did happen in 1934, Lavinia?" Lavinia's voice dropped. "There was a man, someone my aunt had once been involved with. It ended badly. Then he vanished. And there was a child, a scandal, but she kept it quiet, buried it all." Miss Marple's gaze stayed fixed on her. "And the hatbox?" Lavinia hesitated. "It holds letters, photographs, things she kept hidden. I haven't opened it. I'm afraid." Miss Marple leaned forward. "You must. Whatever lies inside may already be known, or worse, altered. You must see for yourself." With trembling hands, Lavinia slowly lifted the lid. Inside were bundles of letters tied with ribbon, a faded photograph of a man in RAF uniform, and a small envelope marked "For Lavinia, only if the past returns." Lavinia opened it with care. Inside was a single sheet. "You are always like a daughter. If Harold returns, he is not to be trusted. He knows things, but he does not know the whole truth. Protect what matters. Not everything buried is meant to be exhumed." A sob caught in Lavinia's throat. Miss Marple took the letter gently. "This does not condemn you. It shields you. But it also leaves a crucial question. Who gains most from Harold's return? And his second death?" The next day, Miss Marple returned to the Rose and Crown for tea. She sat near the fireplace, knitting idly, though her eyes missed nothing. At the bar, Giles Pembroke and Arthur Woodhouse were locked in a tense, hushed exchange. "She knows more than she lets on," Woodhouse snapped. "You're being paranoid," Pembroke replied curtly. "She's asking questions, digging into matters she ought to leave alone." Miss Marple's teacup gave a faint, accidental clink. Pembroke's gaze flicked toward her, their eyes meeting. His look was unreadable. A flicker of surprise followed by something colder. He turned away too quickly. Miss Marple folded her knitting. There it was, the subtle panic of a man who had just been seen. That night, she penned one final note in her diary before bed. Tomorrow I speak to him directly. Not with accusations, but with questions. The kind that draw out what a man fears. For Miss Marple knew something essential. The quiet game was nearly over and the person responsible had already shown their hand. The following evening settled over Netherdean with an almost uncanny stillness. The hedges stood unmoving, and the air carried a strange expectancy, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple sat by her open window at the vicarage, hands resting idly in her lap as the fading light slipped behind the distant hills. Her face was pensive. Though her knitting needles lay untouched beside her, her mind was anything but idle. The encounter at the Rose and Crown the day before had confirmed a long-nurtured suspicion. Giles Pembroke's discomfort had not been acted. It had been instinctive. His glance had not been merely guilty. It had been fearful. And fear, Miss Marple knew, often meant truth was dangerously close to exposure. She rose, donned a cardigan, and tucked a small notebook into her handbag. It was time for a walk, an evening stroll, as the villagers called it, though the purpose of Miss Marple's footsteps rarely had much to do with fresh air or digestion. Taking the long path through the village green, past the allotments, she reached the back gardens of Elderbank Cottage. She did not approach directly. Instead, she followed the curve of a tall hedge dividing the garden from the old orchard, now overgrown, mostly forgotten. The sun had dipped behind the trees, yet a dusky glow still lingered. She paused at the orchard's edge. Then she saw them. Giles Pembroke and Lavinia Pink stood near the garden's back gate, speaking in low tones, their faces taut, posture tight with urgency. Miss Marple made no effort to catch their words. She had no wish to eavesdrop crudely. Instead, she observed the way Giles leaned too close, how Lavinia recoiled, folding her arms tightly across her chest. Her voice, though inaudible, trembled. Giles seemed to reach for her arm. She pulled away, turned sharply, and disappeared into the cottage. Pembroke lingered a moment, then cursed under his breath and strode out through the garden gate, vanishing along the hedgerow path. Miss Marple turned back toward the lane. What she had seen was neither romance nor warm familiarity. It was the strained exchange of two people bound by a shared secrecy, and not, she suspected, by mutual will. The next morning brought a fine drizzle, streaking the windows in shades of gray. The village, always subdued in such weather, seemed half asleep, except for those too anxious to rest. Just before noon, Miss Marple returned to Elderbank Cottage under the guise of delivering a rose cutting from the vicarage garden. Lavinia opened the door with a distracted air. Her eyes were shadowed, her mouth drawn tight. She accepted the ibis cutting absently. "How lovely. Thank you." Miss Marple offered her a gentle smile. "Would you mind if I stepped in for just a moment?" "The rain caught me up, I'm afraid." Lavinia hesitated only briefly. "Of course." Inside, the fire was lit, though the room still held a chill. Miss Marple settled quietly in the drawing room while Lavinia busied herself with the teapot. She waited in silence until the second cup was poured. "I saw you speaking with Mr. Pembroke last night," she said softly. Lavinia's hand gave the slightest tremor as she set down the teapot. "Did you? You seem unsettled. I hope he wasn't pressing you." Lavinia turned toward the window, her back to Miss Marple. "He's not what people think. He's not merely the charming solicitor. He was Aunt Honora's legal man for years." "But he held things over her?" Miss Marple's tone was calm. "Letters, perhaps. Documents. She trusted him, yet he, well, I'm not certain what exactly he did." But when Harold reappeared, Giles suddenly developed an extraordinary interest in the hatbox. He urged me to open it at once, claimed it might hold things he could help sort through. But there was something in the way he said it. She paused. He wasn't trying to help. He was afraid of what might be inside. "And when Harold died, the second time?" Miss Marple asked. Lavinia's eyes shimmered with tears. "Giles told me not to speak to anyone, not the police, not the papers. He said it would all blow over, but I think he knows something. I think he's involved." Miss Marple's nod was steady. You're courageous, Lavinia. But you must be certain. Even unspoken, accusations carry weight. I have no proof, Lavinia whispered. But he was in Aunt Honora's life a long time. He helped her conceal whatever happened in 1934. And now, it's all coming back. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Inspector Cray. She's frightened of Pembroke, she said, and with reason. Cray leaned back in his chair. You think he was involved in Harold Cann's death? I think it's more layered than that, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Pembroke has had access to both Honora's personal papers and her legal affairs for decades. If she were concealing something scandalous, he would know. If she had made provisions, wills, trusts, records, he would control them. It was a powerful position to hold, especially for a man with ambition. Cray frowned. But why kill Canry? Miss Marple laced her fingers together. Perhaps the man who arrived wasn't Harold Cannontree at all. Perhaps he was sent or persuaded to impersonate him. Someone Giles could control. Until he couldn't. Perhaps the second body is the real Canry, or perhaps it's someone else entirely. Cray stared. You're suggesting identity fraud. I'm suggesting desperation, Miss Marple said simply. The sort that festers when long-held secrets are on the verge of being exposed. That evening, as dusk settled once more over Netherine, Miss Marple took another walk, this time toward the churchyard. She paused at Honora Pink's grave, the soil freshly turned, already sagging slightly from the rain. The headstone bore only her name, her birth and death years, and a single line beneath, she kept her counsel. Miss Marple stood silently, her thoughts wandering. It had always struck her as odd that the will had been executed with such haste, and that the solicitor, Pembroke, had refused to read it aloud before witnesses, citing privacy. Now, with the sudden appearance of Harold Canry, or a man claiming to be, those choices seemed far too convenient. She looked up as footsteps approached. Reverend Markham appeared, coat drawn tight against the drizzle. A quiet moment, Miss Marple? She nodded. The vicar paused beside her. Funny thing, secrets. People think they bury them, but in time, they bloom. She turned to him. Yes, vicar. Like foxgloves in the wild, unexpected, and sometimes poisonous. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple wrote a final note in her small leather diary. Giles Pembroke may not have killed Harold, but he's shielding someone who did, or concealing something far older, for which someone was willing to kill. The answer lies in the will, the hatbox, and a garden path no longer walked. Tomorrow I must speak to Arthur Woodhouse alone. He was the only one in the village who didn't flinch when the second body was found. And sometimes, silence speaks, loudest of all. The morning after her visit to the graveyard, Miss Marple sat in the vicarage drawing room, a cup of weak tea beside her and a note carefully folded in her lap. The handwriting was old-fashioned, slanted, and faded with age. She had discovered it tucked into the back of one of Honora Pink's donated books, a worn volume of Tennyson's poetry left at the church jumble. It bore no address, no seal, simply hidden between two pages, forgotten, or placed there deliberately. She unfolded it again. If it ever comes to it, there are 3 names you must never forget: Giles Pembroke, Eleanor Canry, and Arthur W. House. Together, they hold the key to 1934, but only one of them knows the cost. Miss Marple reread the lines several times. The letter was unsigned except for the initials, yet she had no doubt it was from Honora. The handwriting matched her old Christmas cards, several of which Miss Marple remembered receiving over the years. 3 names, one already dead, one possibly missing, and the third, Arthur Woodhouse, still tending his roses as though nothing at all had happened. She rose, fetching her hat and gloves. Arthur Woodhouse's cottage stood slightly apart from the village on a lane called Bramley Rise. The gate gave a soft creak as Miss Marple let herself in. Honeysuckle trailed along the fence, and bees moved lazily from blossom to blossom. She found Arthur in the garden exactly as she expected, trimming a patch of lavender with meticulous care. He looked up as she approached, blinking behind thick spectacles. Miss Marple, come to admire the gladioli? She gave a thin smile. Not exactly, Mr. Woodhouse, though I must say your blooms are looking quite hardy this year. He wiped his hands on a cloth. Would you like to sit? I've some lemonade made up. In a moment, she said gently. I wanted to ask you about Honora and Harold Canry. Arthur froze for just a second, almost imperceptibly. But Miss Marple saw it the way a fencer might read the beginnings of a parry. I don't know what more I can say. Poor woman. She carried her share of secrets, I'm sure. But then, who doesn't? Miss Marple tilted her head. Did you know she left behind a note? Not a suicide note? Nothing so dramatic. Just something tucked into a book, with your name on it. Arthur stiffened again. Did she? She did. Along with Mr. Pembroke's and Eleanor Cantry's. She wrote that the three of you held the key to 1934. Arthur turned away, busying himself with his clippers. Well, that's rather melodramatic of her. 1934 was a long time ago. But you remember it. He hesitated. Everyone does. That was the year Harold disappeared. The first time. And Eleanor? His voice shifted then softer. Eleanor was a kind girl, nervous. She married young, Harold, of course. It was a rushed affair. He had charm, but he lacked, well, let's say steadiness. Eleanor regretted it almost immediately. I think that's when she and Honora grew close. They were both lonely, in their way. Miss Marple nodded. And when Harold vanished, the rumor was he'd run off with someone else, or perhaps gotten into trouble abroad. Eleanor had a breakdown soon after, spending time in a nursing home in Devon. Then she vanished entirely. No one saw her again. No one? Miss Marple pressed. Arthur looked at her sharply. Are you suggesting I'm lying, Miss Marple? No, she said mildly, only that secrets like roots tend to push up through the soil when no one's watching. He sighed and dropped the clippers into the basket. There was something. Eleanor sent a letter to Honora years later. I never read it, but I saw it arrive, postmarked from Brittany, pale blue envelope. Honora burned it in the fireplace, said it was best to let ghosts stay buried. But ghosts rarely obey, Miss Marple said softly. Arthur looked away, his expression unreadable. I didn't kill Harold, Miss Marple. Either time. She regarded him for a moment, then gave a small nod. No, I don't think you did. But I do believe you've been protecting someone who did. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in the village library with Lavinia Pink. The rain had returned, light but steady, tapping against the tall windows as they spoke in hushed tones between the shelves. You mentioned that Giles Pembroke had access to Honora's will, Miss Marple said. Do you know if he handled Eleanor Canry's estate as well? Lavinia blinked. I'm not sure. I never knew Eleanor, only that she was married to Harold. Aunt never spoke of her in detail, but now that you mention it, I do recall Aunt once saying, after a rather nasty headache, that Giles had tied up Eleanor's affairs nicely. I assumed she meant financially. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That, maybe, or it may be that he literally tied them up into silence. Lavinia leaned forward. Do you think Eleanor is still alive? Miss Marple gave a faint smile. I think someone didn't want her to be found, and the only people with that kind of motive are those who knew what really happened in 1934. Perhaps it wasn't Harold who ran off. Perhaps Eleanor tried to leave and was stopped. Lavinia looked pale. You think Aunt Honora helped cover it up? I think she regretted something, deeply enough to leave behind a trail in her own quiet way. And when someone tried to use that secret, someone pretending to be Harold, she panicked. Perhaps he threatened to expose what happened, or perhaps he discovered more than was safe. But what was in the hat box? Lavinia whispered. Miss Marple sipped her tea. I believe it holds a letter from Eleanor, possibly addressed to Honoria. A confession, an accusation, perhaps even a plea. And Pembroke, knowing its significance, wanted it destroyed. Lavenia's voice dropped to a murmur. You don't think Harold was the blackmailer? I think he may have been an opportunist, someone with just enough of the story to play the role and perhaps enough folly to believe he could control it. There was a long silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Finally, Lavenia asked, What do we do now? Miss Marple stood, smoothing her gloves. Now, my dear, we find the one person who saw both versions of Harold and didn't so much as blink, someone who once lived in France. In France? Someone who perhaps recognized the second man, not as Harold at all, but kept silent. Lavenia looked puzzled. Who? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. We're going to pay a call on Mrs. Trelawney in Little Compton. She was Honoria's second cousin, and quite the gossip in her day. If anyone knew Eleanor's fate, it would be her. The lane to Little Compton was winding and uneven, the August hedges spilling into the road like gossip overflowing at a village fete. Miss Marple and Lavenia Pink had secured a ride with young David Lettle, whose battered Morris Minor jostled noisily over the ruts. He didn't ask questions. He knew better than to pry when Miss Marple wore her inquisitive lace bonnet, as the villagers jokingly called her most probing mood. They arrived just after 11. Mrs. Edwina Trelawney's cottage was a large, ivy-covered Georgian house called Thistledown, set back from the road behind a row of laurel bushes. A blue Persian cat watched from the window, blinking with imperial boredom. Miss Marple knocked with her usual discretion. The door opened to reveal a woman of considerable presence. Mrs. Trelawney wore a flowing lavender housecoat and a scarf, of peacock colors draped dramatically around her neck. Her hair was piled high in soft curls, and she carried a silver-tipped cane that appeared more decorative than necessary. Oh, she said, squinting. Aunt Jane. Miss Marple smiled with disarming sweetness. Edwina, dear, it's been far too long. I believe the last time we met was at Colonel Lister's rather disastrous garden party, the one where the gin punch vanished without a trace. Mrs. Trelawney gave a dry laugh. Oh, yes, the year the Colonel attempted orchids and lost a fortune? Instead. Her eyes shifted to Lavenia. And you've brought a companion. Miss Lavenia Pink, said Miss Marple, Honoria's niece. At this, Mrs. Trelawney's demeanor shifted slightly, still cordial, but with a hint of wariness as she stepped aside. Well, you'd best come in, hadn't you? They were ushered into a cool sitting room scented faintly of violets and camphor. The furniture was ornate and overstuffed, and the mantelpiece displayed an astonishing array of porcelain dogs. Mrs. Trelawney settled herself into a wide armchair and gestured toward the tea tray with regal indifference. Pour, would you, Lavenia? My wrists aren't what they once were. Lavenia obliged, while Miss Marple came directly to the point with her quiet precision. Edwina, I wonder if you might remember something from quite some time ago. It concerns Eleanor Cantry. Mrs. Trelawney's teacup paused midair. Eleanor? My word, that's a name I haven't heard in years. But you do remember her. Oh, everyone remembered Eleanor, said Edwina, her eyes suddenly distant. She had that fragile sort of beauty that made men both protective and ridiculous. She was Harold Cantry's wife, at least until he made a fool of her, vanished, and shattered her completely. And then she vanished herself, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Trelawney set down her cup. She was sent away. Honoria insisted on it, claimed Eleanor was becoming unstable and needed treatment. All very hush-hush. There were whispers about a retreat in Devon, but that's not where she went. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. No? Edwina leaned forward. She went to Brittany. I helped arrange it. Honoria confided in me, told me Eleanor had witnessed something that couldn't be undone. I asked what, and she only said, what you don't repeat can't hang you. That was all. Lavenia nearly spilled the sugar bowl. So she was in hiding, Eleanor, for her own good. At least that's what Honoria told herself. The poor girl had started sending letters, rambling things, claiming Harold wasn't who he said he was, that he'd had another name before. They married. Honoria thought she was losing her mind. Miss Marple folded her hands. Did she ever mention what that name might have been? Mrs. Trelawney shook her head. Only that it was foreign, or perhaps only foreign sounding, and changed just before the marriage. That was in 1932. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Lavinia. So, 2 years before Harold disappeared. Yes, said Edwina. And then, well, Eleanor was sent away. She wrote once from Brittany. I saw the envelope. Pale blue, with a French stamp. Honoria burned it without reading, because of what she feared it might contain. I suppose, Mrs. Trelawney said, or perhaps because it confirmed what she already suspected, that Eleanor's delusions weren't delusions at all. Miss Marple's voice was barely more than a whisper. And you never saw Eleanor again? There was a pause. I didn't, Mrs. Trelawney said at last, but that doesn't mean she didn't return. Lavinia's breath caught. Do you think she came back? Mrs. Trelawney tapped her cane against the hearth. A few years later, perhaps 1939, just before the war, I was coming out of the post office in Marlborough and saw a woman across the street. Pale blue scarf, gloves too big for her hands. She looked straight at me and smiled, but didn't cross over. You're certain it was Eleanor? I was at the time, said Edwina. But as the moment passed, I convinced myself I'd imagined perhaps it was someone else. Or perhaps she didn't want to be recognized. Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence. Then she asked, What do you remember about Giles Pembroke during that time? Edwina frowned. Oh, Giles was everywhere, sorting out everyone's affairs. Honoria trusted him implicitly, though I never much cared for him, slick as oiled glass. He settled Eleanor's accounts after she was sent away, and Harold's when he first vanished. He even held power of attorney for a time. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And if someone later tried to impersonate Harold, say, to blackmail, Honoria or claim her estate, Giles would know instantly it wasn't really him. Mrs. Trelawney nodded. Of course. Giles knew the whole tangled history, but he wouldn't expose it. Too tidy, that man. He liked things neatly sealed away in boxes. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt. Then we must see about opening one of those boxes, mustn't we? Edwina gave a curious smile. You always did enjoy unwrapping secrets, Jane. They drove back in silence, the countryside slipping past in late summer gold and green. Lavinia was the first to speak. So if Eleanor wasn't mad, if Harold truly had another name, then who was the man Aunt Honoria met weeks before she died? Miss Marple nodded slowly. Exactly. If the real Harold vanished in 1934, and another man appeared 40 years later, it must have been someone else entirely. Someone who knew enough to impersonate him. Someone who may have worn his identity for years. But then, who killed him? Miss Marple's expression was grave. That, dear Lavinia, is what we must discover. And to do so, we must seek out the one person who may have known both the real Harold and the imposter. The only person who knew them before the names changed. Lavinia blinked. Who? Miss Marple turned her head toward the road, her voice low. A woman who once danced with Harold Cantry in Vienna, who knew his real name before the war. A woman who has waited long enough to speak. She gave a small, knowing smile. Tomorrow, we pay a call on Madame Koenig. The early morning sun cast a gentle glow over the village as Miss Marple and Lavinia Pink set out for Littleford, a small town some 20 miles away. Madame Koenig, a figure spoken of in hushed tones and known to few, lived there in a neat terrace house on Willow Lane. She's a mystery in her own right, Miss Marple confided softly as they rode in the car lent by Reverend Markham. An old friend of Honoria Pink, but with secrets of her own. I believe she may hold the missing pieces to this tangled puzzle. Lavinia shifted uneasily in the passenger seat. The afternoon before, Edwina Trelawney's revelations about Eleanor's possible survival and Giles Pembroke's shadowy role had unsettled her deeply. I never imagined there was so much behind Aunt Honoria's silence. Nor I, Miss Marple said, but sometimes silence speaks louder than words. When they arrived, the modest house was framed by a tidy garden, the air scented with lavender and rosemary. A small brass plaque beside the door read simply, Madame Koenig, piano teacher. From the open window drifted the delicate, wistful strains of a piano. Miss Marple knocked softly. After a pause, the door opened to reveal a slender woman with silver-streaked, black hair pulled into a neat bun. Her dark eyes regarded them with a blend of curiosity and caution. Madame Koenig, Miss Marple began, smiling gently. Yes, the woman replied, her accent lilting and precise. I am she, and you must be Miss Marple. I have heard much. Then you know why we've come, Miss Marple said quietly. Madame Koenig stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The sitting room was warm and inviting, adorned with framed photographs and scattered sheets of music. A grand piano stood by the window, its polished surface catching the morning light. Please sit, Madame Koenig invited. It is rare to welcome visitors from Netherdean, especially those seeking the past. Lavenia's voice trembled slightly. Madame, I am Honoria Pink's niece. We've been trying to uncover what happened to Aunt Honoria and to Harold Cantry. Madame Koenig's eyes darkened. Ah, yes. Harold. She paused, collecting her thoughts. I met Harold Cantry in Vienna, in the summer of 1931, a young man whose charm concealed many shadows. We danced under the moonlight at a cafe on the Ringstrasse. He called himself Harold Schmidt. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Harold Schmidt? Madame Koenig nodded. Yes, his true name. He told me he had fled Germany because of complications, political troubles. Political troubles? Miss Marple echoed. He claimed to be a refugee, but I believe there was more, Madame Koenig replied. Lavenia leaned forward, captivated. Did he say what kind of complications? Only that debts and enemies had followed him. He was restless, always glancing over his shoulder. Yet he was also hopeful. He wanted to start anew, to erase his past. Miss Marple's fingers traced the rim of her teacup. Did you ever hear what became of him after Vienna? Madame Koenig sighed. He vanished in late 1933. I later learned he had married Eleanor Cantry under that false name. She believed she was marrying Harold Schmidt, not Harold Cantry. That explains why Eleanor's letter spoke of a different name, Lavenia murmured. Madame Koenig's gaze hardened. Yes, and that name was the key to it all. His disappearance left Eleanor exposed and desperate. Miss Marple exchanged a look with Lavenia. Do you think Eleanor tried to run? That she left Brittany to hide from what might follow? What might follow? I believe so, Madame Koenig said softly. But it was not only fear. There was betrayal. She drew in a long breath. Harold was mixed up in dangerous business back then. Not the usual petty skullduggery, but something far darker. He was not the man Eleanor believed she had married. Lavenia shivered. What kind of business? Madame Koenig's eyes flickered. Smuggling, perhaps, or worse. Political intrigue, espionage. Vienna was a hotbed of secrets in those years. I heard whispers he was working for the wrong people. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. Do you think he was killed? Almost certainly, Madame Koenig said, but not in the way the village imagines. Lavenia's eyes widened. You mean he wasn't the man found in the woods? No, Madame Koenig replied firmly. That was a body placed there to close a chapter. The truth is far more complicated. Miss Marple leaned forward. And Giles Pembroke? Did you know him then? Madame Koenig gave a thin smile. He was always near Honoria, too near for comfort if you ask me. I never trusted him. He knew more than he admitted and had the means to conceal it. She paused. I warned Honoria once to be cautious with Pembroke, but she wouldn't listen. Why? Lavenia asked, her voice unsteady. Because she owed him, and some debts run deeper than money. Miss Marple's mind turned quickly. She thought again of the hatbox, the letters within, the note from Honoria, warning of loyalty and secrets. Madame Koenig, did Honoria ever mention Eleanor after she vanished? The older woman nodded slowly. She missed her more than she showed, and she regretted the choices she made to protect her. A shadow crossed her features. But there are truths that can destroy families. Some things are better left buried. Miss Marple rose, signaling their visit was over. Thank you, madame. You've given us much to consider. As they stepped into the fresh air, Lavinia exhaled sharply. It's as if a veil has been lifted. Miss Marple was silent a moment, then said, Not lifted, dear. Just drawn back far enough to glimpse what lies beneath. The full picture is still unseen. Their journey back to Netherdean was thoughtful and hushed. The pieces were shifting. Rapidly now, the truth was taking shape. The man who had arrived in the village claiming to be Harold Canry was almost certainly an imposter. Harold Schmidt, a man with a dangerous past and deadly secrets. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Giles Pembroke and his shadowed motives, and to the mysterious contents of the still unopened hatbox. Somewhere among those letters and photographs lay the final key, the truth behind Honoria's guarded past, and the real reason for Harold's second death. And she knew that soon, very soon, the silence would be broken. The day was unseasonably warm for early September, the sun sending long golden fingers through the ancient oaks that lined Netherdean's winding lanes. Miss Marple sat quietly in her favorite armchair by the window, a soft breeze teasing the curtains, her gaze fixed on Elderbank Cottage across the way. The house seemed oddly still. No clink of china, no footsteps in the garden, only the faint rustle of the overgrown hedges. Her thoughts circled the recent revelations. Madame Koenig's account had thrown fresh light on the shadowed life of Harold Canry, the man who was not quite who he seemed. The truth lay knotted in decades of deceit, false names, and whispered threats. And still, the key to the puzzle remained, maddeningly beyond reach. The hatbox. The vicarage clock chimed 11, its measured tones a reminder that the day must advance. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, adjusted her shawl. There were questions to be answered and a garden to be watched. Later that morning, she made her way to Elderbank Cottage, keeping to the narrow hedge path to avoid the main road and its prying eyes. The side gate stood slightly ajar, unusual for Lavinia, who always kept it fastened. Stepping cautiously through, Miss Marple noted the garden's neglect. Wild roses clawing up the trellis, lavender bushes left untended. The stone bench beneath the old pear tree was empty, and the damp scent of earth mingled with the sharp tang of crushed leaves. Her sharp eyes caught it, a scrap of paper pinned beneath a small stone on the garden path. She lifted it delicately. A torn fragment of a letter, edges jagged, ink faded. Do not trust Pembroke. The truth is closer than you think. A chill prickled her spine. Someone had been watching the garden, leaving warnings. She moved deeper toward the cottage, disturbing nothing. Inside, the air was dim and still, touched with a faint mustiness, the scent of stale tea and forgotten memories. On the sitting room table, a single cup remained, its surface clouded with cold tea. Nearby sat the hatbox, its lid still firmly shut. Her fingers longed to open it, but she resisted. Patience was her ally. As she stood there, a sudden creak at the back door startled her. She turned sharply, just in time to see a shadow slip past the kitchen window and vanish into the garden. "Who's there?" she called, steadying her voice. No answer. Miss Marple moved quickly to the door and stepped outside. The garden lay in full sunlight now, the shadows sharp and unyielding. She scanned the hedgerow, but saw only the drifting petals of a fallen rose. "Someone's been here," she murmured, "and not by chance." Footsteps sounded softly behind her. Turning, she saw Lavinia, pale yet resolute. "I came back," Lavinia said, breathless. "I couldn't stay away." Miss Marple gave a small nod. Wise, the garden keeps its secrets. They stood together in silence, watching the stillness. Later that afternoon, Inspector Cray arrived at the vicarage, his face set, his manner purposeful. "I heard there was an incident at Elderbank," Miss Marple said as she poured his tea. Cray set down his umbrella. "Yes, Miss Marple. Signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen, but someone was searching for something. Perhaps the Hatbox, Miss Marple mused. Cray's gaze darkened. You think Pembroke is involved? I think Pembroke would do anything to bury his secrets, she replied quietly. But we've no proof. Yet. The pause that followed was weighted with unspoken possibilities. That evening, mist shrouded the village. The street lamps cast a pale amber glow over the damp cobblestones as Miss Marple and Lavinia returned from a brief call at the post office. They're watching us, Lavinia whispered, her breath a cloud in the cold air. Of that I've no doubt, Miss Marple said. But fear can reveal more than silence. At the Rose and Crown, the usual hum was muted. Giles Pembroke sat alone in a shadowed corner, fingers drumming against his glass. Miss Marple caught his eye and inclined her head. Pembroke looked away quickly, jaw tight. Later, as they walked home beneath the skeletal elms, a figure detached itself from the darkness near the churchyard wall. Miss Marple, a low voice called. It was Reverend Markham, his face pale and drawn. There's been trouble at the rectory, he said urgently. I thought you should know. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. What kind of trouble? A caller, someone demanding to see the vicar, threatening to expose something unless the will and all related documents are handed over. Pembroke? Miss Marple guessed. Markham gave a grim nod. He refused, insisting the village deserved to know the truth. Then he departed, warning that this was only the beginning. Miss Marple's mind quickened. The net was drawing tight, and the stakes had sharpened. That night, back at the vicarage, she sat by the fire, reviewing her notes. The pieces were nearly in place, yet the final picture hovered just beyond reach. Her gaze drifted to the unopened hatbox on the sideboard. It was no longer a mere curiosity. It was the last barrier between truth and ruin. Her thoughts turned to the delicate psychological game ahead, coaxing, observing, pressing without driving anyone into retreat. Pembroke, Lavinia, Arthur, W. House, even the lingering specter of Eleanor, each held a thread in the knotted tapestry. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. Soon, she murmured to the firelight, soon the shadows will have nowhere left to hide. The morning light crept through the curtains of the vicarage sitting room, where Miss Marple and Lavinia Pink sat together, the hatbox resting between them on the heavy oak table. The air was weighted with anticipation. The moment whispered, about in hushed corners and hinted at in guarded glances, had finally arrived. Miss Marple regarded the box with outward calm, though inside she felt the thrill of closing in on the truth. After all the years of silence, of shadows nesting in memory's corners, this small container held the final pieces that could unravel the tangled deceit surrounding Honoria Pink's last days. Are you sure you want to do this now? Lavinia asked, voice tight, her fingers hovering before drawing back. Yes, my dear, Miss Marple said softly. Secrets left unopened are like fires smoldering beneath ash. They only grow hotter, more dangerous when ignored. Slowly, with the careful precision born of decades observing the frailty and resilience of human nature, Miss Marple lifted the lid. Inside, cushioned in faded tissue, lay 3 envelopes, brittle with age, their wax seals stamped with the emblem of a delicate rose. The envelopes were heavy, as though holding more than a single letter. Miss Marple chose the first, and broke the seal. The handwriting within was unmistakable. Honoria Pink's neat script. The letter began, My dear Lavinia, if you are reading this, then the past has finally caught up with me. There are things I could not say in life, truths I feared would destroy us all. But you must know there was never malice in my heart, only fear. Fear of what would happen if the wrong people learned the secret of 1934. Miss Marple paused, letting the words settle. She glanced at Lavinia, whose eyes shimmered with unshed tears. The second envelope bore Giles Pembroke's name. Miss Marple broke this seal next. Mr. Pembroke, you have always known more than you have admitted. You kept the boxes locked and the letters buried, but secrets refuse to remain buried forever. You must now decide whether to guard the truth or become its prisoner. Remember, loyalty is a double-edged sword. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. Beneath Giles Pembroke's polished exterior lay a man walking the narrow edge of danger. The final envelope bore Eleanor Canry's name. Miss Marple unfolded the fragile paper and began to read aloud. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, know that I have never ceased to hope for your safety. The world shifted too quickly, and we all paid a price. I am sorry for the pain you endured, and for the silence that stretched between us like an unending shadow. But remember, even in darkness, there is always a light waiting to be found. Lavinia's voice trembled. She wrote to Eleanor, after all these years. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, and within these letters lie the reasons for the silence, the fear, and the deception. They spent the morning reading each page with care. Honoria's words wove a portrait of love and loss, betrayal and sacrifice. The truth of 1934 emerged in fine detail. Eleanor's marriage to the man calling himself Harold Canry, who was in truth Harold Schmidt, a man with a perilous past and shifting allegiances. The letters recounted Eleanor's discovery of his deceit, his false identity, and his dealings with shadowy figures in Europe. Fearing for her safety, Honoria had arranged Eleanor's quiet removal to Brittany, shielding her from those determined to erase the past. But Honoria's deepest fear was its return, in the form of the imposter Harold, the man who came to Netherdyne years later, reopening old wounds. Miss Marple glanced at Lavinia. Now you see why the hatbox remained closed. It held a secret, capable of shattering reputations and lives. Lavinia brushed away a tear, but someone wanted it destroyed. Yes, someone desperate to keep the past entombed. Later that day, Miss Marple arranged to meet Inspector Cray and Giles Pembroke at the vicarage. The inspector arrived with brisk precision, but Pembroke entered more cautiously, his eyes guarded beneath a carefully composed smile. Miss Marple spoke without preamble. Mr. Pembroke, you have been the custodian of many secrets in this village, but the letters in this hatbox have forced them into daylight. Pembroke's jaw tightened. Miss Marple, I have done nothing but shield this community from scandal. Perhaps, she replied evenly. But protection can slip into concealment, and concealment breeds suspicion. She slid the letter addressed to him across the table. Pembroke's fingers quivered as he read. Loyalty is a double-edged sword, Miss Marple repeated softly. What is it you fear, Mr. Pembroke? He looked up, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. That the truth will destroy far more than reputations. Inspector Cray cleared his throat. We need answers, Pembroke. The man who came here pretending to be Harold Canry was not who he claimed. And the disappearance of Eleanor Canry is connected. Pembroke's shoulders sagged, a fleeting crack in his polished facade. I kept matters quiet to protect Honoria, to protect the village, but perhaps I was wrong. Miss Marple inclined her head. The time for silence has passed. That evening, as dusk descended, Miss Marple and Lavinia returned to Elderbank Cottage. The garden lay still and serene, yet the air thrummed with tension. Miss Marple glanced toward the hatbox, now empty save for the 3 letters. The truth had surfaced, but one question remained. Who had killed the man who came to Netherdyne? And why? She turned to Lavinia, her gaze keen. We have unearthed the past. Now we must watch the present. The shadows deepened, the mystery lingering like the final glimmer of daylight. Morning mist clung low over Netherdyne as Miss Marple and Lavinia made their way to the village hall, where a meeting had been hastily convened. The subdued murmur of the gathered villagers spoke of a community far more shaken than any would openly admit. Whispers of imposters, secret letters, and long-buried betrayals drifted through the crisp air like fallen autumn leaves. Miss Marple moved with steady purpose through the crowd, her discerning eyes noting faces etched with suspicion, fear, and in some cases, guilt. Giles Pembroke stood rigid near the doorway, his usual polished composure frayed by recent events. Arthur Woodhouse, the vicar's trusted assistant, leaned toward the baker's wife, his brows knit in thought. Beside Miss Marple, Lavenia's youthful face was pale but resolute. The village constable rapped his hand on the table, calling the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss the recent revelations concerning the cannery estate and the unfortunate events surrounding the stranger who came to Netherdean. Miss Marple has kindly agreed to guide us through what has been uncovered." Miss Marple nodded and stepped forward. "Thank you for coming. It's clear that what we face is not merely a puzzle of identity or inheritance, but a study in human weakness and fear. The man who claimed to be Harold Cannery was an imposter. This fact changes much, but it also opens the path to justice." Her gaze swept the room. "What we must discover now is why he came, and who wished to silence him." A stillness settled over the assembly. "Mr. Pembroke," Miss Marple said gently, "you have been a keeper of secrets for many years. Can you tell us what you know about the man who came here under false pretenses?" Pembroke swallowed, then spoke with surprising candor. "The man? He was clever, persuasive. He knew enough of the family history to convince most of us, but there were gaps, details only the real Harold would have known. I grew suspicious, but I feared what exposing him might set loose." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And what was it you feared?" Pembroke's eyes flickered. "That the past would return with a vengeance, that old wounds and betrayals would rip this community apart." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "it is time to let those wounds heal in the light, rather than fester in the dark." The door opened quietly, and Arthur Woodhouse entered, his steps deliberate, carrying a small folded slip of paper. "I've found something," he announced. Among the papers left by Honoria Pink was this note, hidden inside a book of poetry. It appears to have been written in haste. Miss Marple unfolded the paper with care. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably Honoria's. The key is not what it seems. Trust no one who claims to protect. The Hatbox holds more than memories. It is the safeguard of truth. Beware the shadow that walks in daylight. A low murmur rippled through the room. Miss Marple's gaze fixed on Pembroke. "Do you recognize this warning?" Pembroke's face paled. I might," she continued. "It suggests that someone close to Honoria sought to guard the secret, yet feared betrayal from within." Lavenia's voice broke the silence, firm despite the tremor beneath. "Then who is this shadow? Who walks in daylight yet hides in darkness?" Miss Marple allowed a faint smile. "That is the question we must answer." After the meeting, the villagers drifted away slowly, leaving Miss Marple, Lavenia, Pembroke, and Woodhouse alone in the now empty hall. Pembroke paced, uneasy. "Miss Marple, I believe there's one person you haven't questioned thoroughly, someone present yet silent." "And who might that be?" Miss Marple asked. "Miss Eleanor Cannery's old friend, Catherine Bligh. She arrived in Netherdean only weeks ago, and I've seen her speaking privately with Giles on several occasions." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "Ah, the elusive Miss Bligh. She certainly warrants a visit." Woodhouse nodded in agreement. "I agree. There is something about her presence here that does not sit well." That afternoon, Miss Marple and Lavenia set out for the small cottage at the edge of the village where Catherine Bligh was staying. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the golden fields. The cottage was tidy, its wild garden overflowing, with herbs and flowers. Catherine opened the door before they could knock. Tall, poised, her eyes sharp as if weighing every detail at once. "Miss Marple," she greeted, her voice cool but not unkind. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Miss Marple smiled. "We are here about Honoria Pink and Eleanor Cannery, and the shadows that have settled over their past." Catherine's expression flickered. "I knew them well." "Then perhaps you can help us understand," Miss Marple said gently. "Why a stranger would come to Netherdean under a false identity, and why someone would wish him silenced." Catherine's gaze hardened. "You speak of Harold Schmidt." "Yes, Harold Cannontree, as he was known here." Catherine stepped aside, gesturing them into a small, neatly kept parlor. "He was dangerous, and he brought ruin to many lives." Lavenia's voice wavered. "Why?" "Because beneath the charm was a man desperate to hide his true self." He fled shadows from his past, but those shadows followed. Catherine's eyes darkened. He played dangerous games with powerful people, espionage, betrayal, lies. Eleanor was caught in the crossfire. Miss Marple folded her hands. And the Hatbox. It contained evidence, letters, photographs, proof of identities and treachery. The kind of truth that could destroy both families and governments. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So, the man who was found dead, was he silenced to protect a greater secret? Catherine's gaze held steady. Yes, but the real secret is still hidden. Miss Marple's voice lowered. Then we must find the final piece. That night, back at the vicarage, Miss Marple sat with Lavinia and Inspector Cray, reviewing the threads they had gathered. The shadow in daylight is someone trusted, Miss Marple said. Someone who thrives in silence. Pembroke, Woodhouse, Bly each hold secrets, but only one is the murderer. Inspector Cray frowned. The pieces nearly fit, but not quite. We need a spark. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And that spark will come soon. Lavinia looked at her with hope. You truly believe the truth will set us free? Miss Marple nodded. It always does, dear. But first, it must be brought to light. The night deepened, carrying with it the promise of revelation and the closing of long-buried chapters. It was just past 7 in the morning when Miss Marple rose from bed and drew open the curtains at the vicarage. The sun had not yet crested the horizon, but the sky wore the pale apricot glow of approaching dawn. She had slept little, yet her mind, sharp as ever, had found more rest than her body. The pieces, once scattered like a jigsaw flung aside in haste, were finally beginning to align. Downstairs, Lavinia sat at the breakfast table, staring absently into a bowl of porridge. She looked up as Miss Marple entered. You didn't sleep either, she said quietly. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. No, my dear, but I believe the time for answers has arrived. By 9 o'clock, Miss Marple had summoned Inspector Cray, Giles Pembroke, Arthur Woodhouse, and Catherine Bly to the vicarage drawing room. The space, usually warm and scented faintly of pipe smoke, now felt charged, like the stillness before a summer storm breaks. The inspector stood near the hearth, arms folded. Giles Pembroke paced the rug with restless agitation. Woodhouse sat stiffly in the far corner, lips drawn tight. Catherine Bly remained by the window, her poise unshaken. Miss Marple folded her, hands in her lap. I am most grateful you have come. It is never easy to face the past, especially when it is knotted with deceit, regret, and loss. But without understanding it, we cannot make sense of what has unfolded in our village. Her gaze touched each of them in turn before she went on. Let us begin with the man who claimed to be Harold Cannontree. We now know he was not Harold at all, but Harold Schmidt, an operator who worked under many aliases after the war. He dealt in the quiet gathering of information, sometimes for governments, sometimes for private buyers. His talent for assuming identities was exceptional. And you believe he was murdered? Asked Inspector Cray. I am certain. Of it, Miss Marple replied. He was not merely an impostor, but a danger to those with secrets worth keeping. He came to Netherdean not simply to pose as Harold Cannontree, but to uncover, or perhaps sell, whatever was concealed in Honoria, Pink's hatbox. Pembroke gave a sharp sound of protest. That box again. I still fail to see its importance. Oh, it is very important, Miss Marple said mildly, for it contained the final link in an old story. Letters, photographs, proof of a relationship long denied between Eleanor Cannontree and a man thought dead. Lavinia's voice was soft. My grandfather. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, my dear. But more than that, Eleanor's child, her secret, was preserved in letters hidden away by Honoria, out of loyalty, shame, or both. When Honoria fell ill, she meant to put matters right. That is why she sent for the solicitor and drafted the codicil, Catherine murmured, but she died before she could act. Or, Miss Marple said, her tone hardening, someone made certain she did. The room fell utterly still. Honoria was not merely elderly. She was active, decisive, in full command of her affairs. Yet she fell suddenly ill after only a single cup of tea. Tea that, as I've discovered, was not brought by the maid, but by you, Miss Bly. Catherine straightened. I only did what I was asked. Honoria valued her routine. Yes, Miss Marple replied evenly. But the question is, did she also value having her secrets revealed? Pembroke broke in, his voice taut. Surely you're not implying— I am suggesting, Miss Marple said firmly, that someone who knew of the codicil and what it would mean for the Cantry estate had reason to stop it. Someone who stood to gain from the inheritance, uncontested. All eyes turned toward Pembroke. He bristled. Preposterous. My involvement was purely administrative. I managed the estate for Miss Eleanor. I knew nothing of any codicil until after Honoria's death. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. And yet you were among the first to meet the impostor upon his arrival. You vouched for him publicly. You walked him through the estate's history. Why? Pembroke stepped back. I wasn't certain at first, but he had papers, and I thought it best to avoid scandal. You feared your own loss, Miss Marple said softly, though each word struck like a pin. You knew Eleanor had a child, didn't you? You helped keep it hidden. What? Woodhouse stirred suddenly. There's more, he said, his voice rough. Miss Marple's right. Giles told me years ago about Eleanor's situation. Said it would ruin the family name if it ever came out. I didn't know the details until Honoria mentioned the Hatbox a month ago. And did you tell anyone? Miss Marple asked. Woodhouse lowered his gaze. Only Catherine. I thought she could help keep it quiet. She understood the stakes. Miss Marple turned to Catherine. And you did help, but not by protecting the truth. You silenced Honoria. Catherine's face remained still for a moment. Then she released a slow breath. She was going to undo everything, she said at last. She believed Lavinia deserved the truth. But Lavinia is not Eleanor's daughter. She is mine. Gasps rippled through the room. She was born during a time when my reputation would have been ruined, Catherine continued. Eleanor offered to help. She raised her as kin. Honoria swore she would protect us both. It became our secret. And when that man arrived, threatening to profit from the past, I panicked. I never meant to kill Honoria, only to keep her sedated long enough to take the documents. Miss Marple's expression was touched with sadness, though she looked far from surprised. And when he came, claiming to be Harold Cantry, you knew he could shatter everything. Yes, Catherine whispered. I didn't kill him, I swear it. But I didn't stop the one who did. Silence closed over the room. It was Pembroke who finally spoke, his tone flat. It was me. He threatened to reveal the contents of the Hatbox unless I paid him. Claimed he'd already taken photographs. I didn't know if he was bluffing, and I couldn't take the chance. One push down the mill slope. It looked like an accident. Inspector Cray stepped forward. Cuffs. Ready. You'll have the chance to explain that in court. Miss Marple turned to Lavinia, who stood trembling. And now, my dear, you know the truth, not only of a crime but of your beginnings. You were never unwanted, merely hidden. And that, you see, is a very different thing. Lavinia moved toward Catherine, who seemed frozen in shock. You're my mother. Tears filled Catherine's eyes. Yes. Lavinia took her hand. Then let's begin again. Honestly. Miss Marple watched them, eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. The storm had passed. The truth at last stood in the open. The end.